Yes, fellow mycelia, we're here to discuss enhancing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy with models of the brain. My name is Martin. This is Sammy. So we're both based in Toronto. I'm at the University Health Network as well as the University of Toronto, and Sammy's at York University studying to become a clinical psychologist. I am in just kind of the auspices of computer science and health, the kind of intersection. So the more pretentious name for our presentation is proposing a mixed methods approach to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, integrating spiking neural network models with individual experiences. This is very verbose scientific. It's something just to help ground us into the different aspects of the work that we're trying to construct. And so the agenda today is 5 different chapters. The first will be the proposed integrative model. The second will be a review of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So just sort of defining what PAP is. We're going to then look at quantitative and then qualitative methods, and then finally look at mixed methods integration, what that looks like in research and what that looks like in practice, discuss some ethical implications, and then next steps. So we're going to start with the proposed integrative model. This is a visual abstract of, again, this proposed conceptual, but integrative model. And so obviously you have here the psychotherapist as well as the client. They work in this PAP space as well as other kind of psychotherapy paradigms. But the idea is that from the client, there's self-reported language data as well as more measured data such as fMRI, EEG, so both like imaging as well as just measuring the electrical impulses on the surface of your head. We've included survey data here because it's something to distinguish between self-reported language data. Here we consider survey data as anything that can become coded into numbers. And so there's helpful emoji here. There's an element here that is the spiking neural network models. We'll see that it's just basically a model of the brain. And so we're going to be referring back to this sort of as a map to kind of at least conceptually orient ourselves. And so to motivate this, why, who cares, why does this matter? Why are we doing this? It's because we want to include neural circuitry into research and therapy. And what can that look like? That can look like the clustering of neurobehavioural phenotypes by biomarkers, or like neuromarkers, let's call them. And so, okay, it's cool. DSM has a bunch of symptoms, a checklist. You can categorize. How helpful is this for actually improving quality of life? Who's to say? But the categorizations matter. And it only goes so far though, right? So here you see that there are all these different symptoms, these labels that we have, but they may be being generated by different neural processes, different biological processes. So this basically this Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon spectrum is trying to separate out what we cluster together in our symptom checklists into the neural processes that generated that behavior. And so, okay, what is this prism going to be then? We can at least say that we want it to be grounded in something called the research domain criteria. And this is basically a hierarchy of different scientific domains going from this nice ladder of abstraction: genes, molecules, cells, circuits, physiology, behavior, and self-reports. And so Sammy sort of occupies the right side, I sort of occupy the left side, and we're trying to come together at the neural circuitry level, at least, in order to produce some knowledge, especially in the psychedelic space, because it will help with the sort of normalization of the content matter, as well as make it more valid to the community at large, the scientific community at large. And so why, who cares? We care because neuroscience is the psychotherapist's tool. And this is especially true in psychopharmacology and in the psychedelic space. So that's our model, the visual abstract. We'll see it again soon. But we're going to now talk about a review of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, or PAP. And so going back to the map, it occupies this lavender hexagon here. It's the relationship between the psychotherapist and the client. But again, it's just one kind of psychotherapy that you can undertake. So what is PAP? We can at least say that it is a wicked problem. And we define a wicked problem as a problem that does not have a consistent definition across disciplines of study. That's to say that it's something that has so many dimensions of analysis that it eludes tractability when you're trying to make universal claims. And so, at least in this paper by Reef, it was a review. It discussed a sort of spectrum from psycholytic to psychedelic practice. And that distinction is made along the dimension of dosage and emphasis. It's basically saying that the psycholytic approach is coming out of a psychoanalysis tradition, and the psychedelic approach is one that is higher in dosage, but also not necessarily suited to any practice of psychotherapy. So my point here is that this is a historically contingent, non-entheogenic distinction, right? It kind of points to the fact that defining PAP is going to become a politico-scientific problem. Its legality, its access, its validity, scientifically speaking, socially. And so these are all things that we have to be aware of. And especially in the psychedelic space, especially seeing what's happened after at least the cannabis space in Canada. I think for us as practicing like knowledge producers, we have to build interdisciplinary alliances, and we have to be critical of when PAP can be territorialized by capital or even become sutured to any sort of one practice, because it's important to be open about it. And so let's be specific though. What can a PAP program look like? So there's three different stages: the preparatory, the medication, and the integration. And again, this can be combined with any other like non-psychedelic assisted psychotherapy programs. Like one does not have to suture themselves to a practice. But let's run through this as an example. Like what kind of like discussions are being had in these sessions? In the preparatory, we're talking about like, okay, the therapist comes to the client. What have you heard of psychedelics? What are your therapy goals? Do you have any expectations? And then if there's curiosity or there's kind of an eagerness to kind of pursue it, then you ask, okay, this is how a session would look like. And I think in the future, we're going to have VR like computing capacity to be able to totally simulate it. And then the neuroscience to back up those simulations in VR, it will be an important scientific, or at least exciting scientific problem. But this is what we're talking about when we're talking about preparatory. The next stage is the medication. Obviously loaded word, but we're using it because it comes from the literature. So the idea here is that they'd be kind of reinforcing a safe and open space for the client. So you're talking about things like, okay, just contact your body and breath. How do you feel? What's going through your mind? Just things to allow them to reflect inward. And then the last step in this, at least cycle, is what moments stood out? What do you think of those moments? Did you engage with that moment? What did you learn? How does this change things? And so it's an integration of their experience into meaning. And so the three of these in this linear fashion is what Reef identified as sort of what kind of PAP practices were out there in the review. And so we can ask ourselves, okay, in this PAP, what kind of relationships exist? So it's important to remember that the distinctions that we draw determine the relationships we can analyze. So breaking PAP down to a therapist, client, drug, and setting, there's a lot of different kinds of relationships we can draw. Obviously, the first and most important one is the therapist and client. So there has to be a therapeutic alliance. Another example is clinical psychopharmacology. So under what cases should a therapist prescribe what drugs? And so that's a relationship, again, between the therapist, client, and drug. And then even things like client-centeredness. So for like, how do you reinforce and how do you maintain that subjective privileging for the client? And so it'd be a question of the client, the drug, and the setting. So to return to our question, what is PAP? PAP is a construction of a working alliance facilitating inward experiencing during psychedelic states. So moving on to the next chapter, quantitative. In this case, going back to our map, it is going to be the spiking neural networks on the left, and then the data, specifically fMRI and EEG, up in the top right quantitative data section. So we can ask, what is the quantitative approach? Specifically, what are these spiking neural network models? SNNs for short. Well, they are mathematical equations that model network dynamics of synapses and neurons. So you start with the big brain here. The brain is just a lot of these networks of neurons and synapses, different kinds of neurons, different kinds of synapses. But the synapses have a neurochemical interaction that creates an electrical impulse along the axon of the neuron, and that could be propagated through the network. And so this is something that has been implemented and realized on low-power neuromorphic silicon chips. And so it allows for a more biologically inspired form of computing. So that's nice. We're trying to recreate brains into silicon chips, and the models of these are SNN models. And so, like, how does it determine any sort of computation? It determines it by the network. So the connectivity. This will be an important topic in a couple of slides, but the idea is that the different organizations of neurons and their synapses determines the classes of computation that are possible. But when you choose the right kind of information processing and the right kind of topology, the right kind of problem, then these models become highly efficient models for information processing. And again, this goes from all levels of abstraction, from sensory motor, which is mostly feed forward, to cognitive, which is basically a combination of all these. What we're going to be talking about in the Doberger paper is this reservoir computing. But the question to get to the Doberger is, what can you do with these SNN brain models? And what you can do is measure differences. You can measure differences in brains between time points. So Doberger used the Kasabov model, which is on the left side here, the new cube model, to measure connectivity differences before and after mindfulness therapy. And what they did was they just measured the EEG before patients or participants went under mindfulness therapy, and then they measured baseline EEG after the fact. And so they did this, and then they applied the neural network, these SNN models, to each of those time points, and then tried to measure differences between them. So there's three categories of participants that you can see here. One, first is just the control, non-depressed control group. And then there's another one, which is the depressed but responsive to therapy group. And then there is the depressed but non-responsive to therapy group. And so what Doberger found was that basically in this responsive group, there were statistical differences in the connectivity for that group. And that statistical differences came out of the model of these SNNs. So you take two different SNN models, and then you compare them, and then you look at the statistical difference of the connectivity, of the topology of the network. And so the question is, okay, they did this for mindfulness therapy. Like, can we do the same thing for PAP? Can we do the same thing for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy? Can we measure differences in brain connectivity before and after psychedelics? And furthermore, what is a scientifically informed before and after? What kind of time resolution should you be having? Like, obviously, it'd be nice to do everyday EEG, but then is that a viable thing that you can even do? So scientific questions like that are interesting. So to return back to the question, what is a quantitative approach? It is a biologically inspired network model. And parenthetically, it's here of cognition, because that's more or less the holy grail in the field of SNNs. So to move to the next chapter, we have the qualitative. To come back to our map, this is the right side, talking about self-reported language data, like what the client brings to the therapist in their language. And again, language will play a key role here. So we asked, what is a qualitative approach? And we answer by contrasting it against quantitative. Here on the right side, quantitative is about measured numerical data. This data, this vectorization, these numbers, they're very comportable to mathematical modeling, but they are drawing a sample out of what we call experience. In the qualitative research realm, it's a lot different. You're privileging the language. So it becomes a descriptive language data that becomes, whose analysis becomes about finding patterns and themes of meaning. And there's this recursive relationship between experience and subjectivity towards language. So it's an epistemological distinction that is inevitable, basically, but it's important. We're saying that it's important to kind of to dialectically synthesize them back together into an integrative model. So speaking of, if qualitative data is about language, it's about themes, what kind of themes have appeared in the PAP reviews in the literature? So Brixema did a review of 15 studies, and they found 4 main themes when dealing with like recalling participants' experiences in psychedelic treatments for psychiatric disorders. And so the 4 themes are the phenomenology of experience, so what they experienced. The second one is the perspectives on intervention. The third one is the therapeutic processes, and the fourth one is the outcomes of intervention. So these are the 4 main themes that appear in this review. And I think we want to emphasize that n equals 15 is not a very good number, obviously. Like as a mathematician, for me, n equals infinity is the only appropriate number, but I realize in the world it's not possible. And the scientific strive should be about getting this number as high as possible while maintaining a certain level of rigor. It's important to note that like this is not something, these themes are not something that can be codified and like quantified, but that they arise out of the qualitative research. So to answer the question, what is the qualitative approach? We're saying that it's a person privileging subjective meaning making, and that can end up as a relationship between the therapist and the client, where they construct a meaning out of what the client brings to the therapist in language. And so we use languaging here as a verb in order to kind of orient us towards the process of it, and not as an essentialist goal. Hey, so finally, we've made it to the mixed methods, the final section, where all this comes together, hopefully. Now we're going to talk about the research and practice. And again, this at the map, this looks like everything. It's going to be what the integration looks like. One could say that it's all the arrows, but just to kind of totalize it as the integrative model, we can ask, what is mixing methods? So we can define it as, in lay terms, bringing together of qualitative and quantitative data into a unified study. And so this integration can happen either at data collection or analysis. And for PAP, I think for us, it's pretty obvious here in this diagram that the ordering of EEG collection and sessions is integrative. It matters what order you're doing this. If you're languaging throughout the sessions, but if you only collect EEG before and you don't look after, what kind of integration can you do? If you only collect it after, again, what kind of integration can you do? It's about kind of interweaving the different data collection and being able to be adaptive to what kind of tools you have. But that's just in the data collection, right? Okay, well, we want the analysis parts. How is this analytically integrative? By mixing the languaging, the EEG, and the neural models, we can be integrative because it becomes a narrative between neural correlates in the client's language. What does that mean? That means that the therapist becomes sensitized to differences in neural models over time for an individual client. Again, it's important to emphasize that we're trying to privilege the client's own knowing experience, but the therapist becomes sensitized to the neuroscience of it. They use it as a tool to make better informed decisions and to be able to bring a stronger healing practice to the client. So to answer the question, what is mixing methods? It's when the therapist becomes sensitized to neural correlates of behavior and self-reported experience. It's like, what if your psychotherapist also moonlit as a neuroscientist? What if they were just reading the literature in their free time about what the most state-of-the-art spiking neural networks? The work that I'm doing at the hospital right now and that we're trying to bring in Sammy and we're trying to collaborate is that we want to be able to produce the tools that allow different domains to be able to leverage their knowledge. And it's basically mostly going to be digital, and it's going to be an interesting ride. So the psychedelic coming to the forefront now is a really seminal moment, which is great segue for ethical problems. So like at the hospital, it's a huge problem about ownership of data, governance of data. Like if there's a leak or a breach, then whose ass is getting fired? Like these are things to think about if the quantitative methods are to be integrated into the PAP and brought to the clinical space and not just in research. Another one is the client receptiveness to inclusion of the quantitative approach. Like there's the risk of objectifying the client to be a scientific object, and that's something that the psychotherapist who moonlights as a neuroscientist always has to keep in mind in order to remain critical in their practice. And obviously beyond remaining critical, it's important to be educated. So there's a huge element of like, okay, how do we communicate neuroscience to therapy, and how can they become, again, integrated in practice? And how can we include the participants in this education as well, right? There is no, this myth of power is not real. So to conclude, we have a couple of research directions. Can we improve neuroscientific understanding about psychedelic states using these state-of-the-art biologically plausible brain models, these spiking neural networks? Can we construct RDoC-based correlations between these models and self-reports? And then from that research, can we integrate these different models to inform therapists' responsive participation? These are obviously very like broad and open-ended, and they're meant to be. Hopefully this has been a kind of intersection of these two, at least from us. It's been really rewarding to do this. So we just wanted to thank everyone, thank the organization, fellow mycelia. It's been a pleasure. I guess questions will be later, but yeah. Also references, but this is a lot nicer to look at.